We've only uploaded a single video in 2025 with the word 5800X3D in the title. And that was a Q&A, so I'm not sure that even counts. Therefore, to make 2025 official, I have an in-depth benchmark video that focuses on the Ryzen 7 5800X3D, so that will no doubt make a great many of you very happy. And you know what makes us happy? Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by ASUS and their new Tough Gaming B850 Plus Wi-Fi motherboard designed to fully support the latest AMD Ryzen 9000 series processors. Armed with 14 80-amp power stages just for the V-Core, it can tackle even the Ryzen 9 9950X with ease, and I verified the board to work flawlessly with DDR5 8000 memory. You're also getting ultra-fast Wi-Fi 7 with ASUS Q antenna, 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, pre-installed I/O shield, 20 gigabits per second USB, PCIe 5.0 for the graphics card with Q release, while the primary M.2 also supports PCIe 5.0 with Q latch. There's loads more features, so to check out the ASUS Tough Gaming B850 Plus Wi-Fi, please click the link in the video description. Alright then, so this is another CPU and GPU scaling benchmark, and therefore it's unlike your typical CPU or GPU benchmark content, whether that be a review or a massive head-to-head benchmark covering 40 games. Instead, for this one, we have just 4 games, and that's for the simple reason that providing CPU and GPU scaling data takes an incredible amount of time per game. This is because each game has been tested using 2 different quality presets, medium and ultra, at 3 resolutions with 4 different GPUs for a total of 48 data points, each based on a 3-run average. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, it takes a lot of time to test just 4 games, so unfortunately, that's all you're getting. Now, outside of the medium and ultra presets, along with the 3 resolutions being 1080p, 1440p and 4K, we also have 4 tiers of GPUs. The GeForce RTX 5090, RTX 5080, RX 9070, and the 9060 XT 16GB. Normally I'd stick with Nvidia GPUs, but with the RX 9070 being quite popular and the 9060 XT 16GB looking like the best value choice right now, I thought it might make sense to include them. Plus the RTX 5080 and RX 9070 data might give us some insight into whether or not the driver overhead is still an issue, so let's get into the data. Starting with Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, using the medium quality preset, we find that when using the RTX 5090, the 5800X3D is just 15% faster than the 5600 and 13% slower than the 7600X. And it's a similar story when using the RTX 5080, and it's not until we drop down to the RX 9070 that it's roughly able to match the 7600X. All of that said, when using the Radeon RX 9070, we find some rather odd data. Both Ryzen 5 processors, along with the 5800X3D, become faster when using what is a slower GPU, evidenced by the 9800X3D result. But in the case of the 7600X, it's now 10% faster using the Radeon GPU when compared to what we saw with the RTX 5090, while the 5800X3D is 25% faster. But even more crazy are the Ryzen 5 5600 results. This CPU is 32% faster when paired with the Radeon GPU, jumping up from 337 FPS to 446 FPS. That's an insane increase that was highly repeatable. These findings are in line with examples I first found 4 years ago now, where the GeForce overhead issue in DirectX 12 games could reduce performance by over 20%. Also, as a side note, if you happen to be upset that I didn't include the 9070 XT, please don't be. We can see that the RX 9070 can go faster than 446 FPS, which is evident when looking at the 7600X and 9800X3D data, so that means a faster Radeon GPU would have had no impact on the Ryzen 5 5600 results. We have found the limits of this CPU when paired with the 9070. Anyway, when seeing these odd-looking results, please note this isn't a mistake, rather it's highlighting the overhead issue that you can run into at times with a GeForce GPU when the data is heavily CPU limited. Increasing the resolution to 1440p with the medium preset, we find that when using the RTX 5090, the Ryzen 7 5800X3D is 7% slower than the 7600X and 31% slower than the 9800X3D. It's also just 14% faster than the 5600, and I have to say it's impressive just how well the old Ryzen 5 processor is performing here. Now, downgrading the GPU to the RTX 5080 results in mostly GPU-limited data for the 5800X3D, 7600X, and 9800X3D. For example, the 5800X3D is now just 4% slower than the 7600X and 7% slower than the 9800X3D. Then with the Radeon RX 9070, we're looking at identical performance across the board as the results become heavily GPU-limited, and of course the same applies to the 9060 XT 16GB data. For gaming at 4K with the medium settings, you're going to end up GPU limited in all scenarios with the 5800X3D, so newer AM5 processors offer nothing here in the way of additional frames. Switching to the Ultra Plus preset and starting back at 1080p, we see that the 5800X3D is again slower than the 7600X, this time 8% slower using the RTX 5090, and then just 3% slower with the RTX 5080. So if you were to upgrade from a 5800X3D, you'd really need to be doing so with either a 7800X3D or 9800X3D, and even then, you need a high-end GPU, or you need to be playing using low-quality settings to realize the difference. And we're quickly running back into heavy GPU-limited gaming data with the 5800X3D at 1440p. Here performance was very much GPU-limited using the RTX 5080, RX 9070, and 9060 XT 16GB. Even with the RTX 5090, the 5800X3D was just 4% slower than the 7600X and 8% slower than the 9800X3D. Then, if you plan on playing at native 4K with the maximum in-game quality settings, chances are CPU performance isn't going to matter, at least within reason, as the Ryzen 5 5600 was able to match the 9800X3D, even with the RTX 5090 installed. The Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 results are a bit different to what we saw when testing with Rainbow Six Siege, mostly because here the 5800X3D is slightly faster than the Ryzen 5 7600X, delivering 9% greater performance when using the RTX 5090. That said, it was still 26% slower than the 9800X3D, but also a massive 39% faster than the Ryzen 5 5600. Now, switching to the RTX 5080, that does heavily reduce the performance of the 9800X3D, and now the data is GPU limited, and as a result, the 5800X3D is just 6% slower. Then when compared to the 5600, the 5800X3D was 33% faster, so a big increase there. And then once we drop down to the RX 9070, the data becomes largely GPU limited before ending up 100% GPU limited with the 9060 XT 16GB. As you'd expect, upping the resolution to 1440p increases the GPU load, but even so, the 5800X3D was still 14% slower than the 9800X3D when running the mighty RTX 5090, but it also managed to beat the 5600 by a 36% margin. All of that said, these margins are heavily eroded once we downgrade to the RTX 5080. Now all four CPUs are seen delivering very similar average frame rate performance, though the 1% lows of the 9800X3D are still very strong. But once we drop down to the RX 9070 and 9060 XT 16GB, all data ends up 100% GPU limited. Then at 4K, even with the medium preset, we find the data to be largely GPU limited, and in fact, using the RTX 5080, RX 9070, and 9060 XT 16GB, the results are all 100% GPU limited. But we see when using the RTX 5090, there is some variation in the results, but with the 5800X3D being just 4% slower than the 9800X3D, the overall experience is going to be very much the same. The 5800X3D performs very well in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 when using the ultra quality settings, coming in just 8% slower than the 9800X3D at 1080p when both CPUs are paired with the RTX 5090. And that being the case, dropping down to the RTX 5080 sees both of these X3D CPUs delivering very similar performance. Now, upping the resolution to 1440p does eliminate any real performance differences between the 9800X3D and 5800X3D, even when using the RTX 5090, as here the older AM4 processor was just 3% slower. That being the case, performance at 4K is near enough to call identical, and in fact it was when using the RTX 5080, RX 9070 and 9060 XT 16GB. Moving on to Marvel Rivals, we'll again start at 1080p using the medium quality preset. And we see when using the RTX 5090, there's quite a wide spread of results, though the 5800X 3D is just 7% slower than the 7600X when comparing the average frame rate, and a more substantial 14% slower when looking at the 1% lows. Despite that, the 5800X 3D was still 36% faster than the Ryzen 5 5600, but also a massive 33% slower than the 9800X 3D. The margin to the 9800X 3D though is significantly reduced when downgrading the GPU to the RTX 5080. Here we're looking at a cap of 183 FPS with the Zen 5X 3D chip, making the 5800X 3D just 8% slower, though it was still 42% faster than the 5600. Then when using the RX 9070, performance between the 5800X 3D, 7600X and 9800X 3D is neutralized due to a strong GPU bottleneck. Increasing the resolution to 1440p provided some fairly typical results. The only real difference between these CPUs can be seen when using the RTX 5090, where the 5800X 3D was 5% slower than the 7600X and 19% slower than the 9800X 3D. Beyond that though, all three CPUs delivered the same level of performance using the RTX 5080, RX 9070 and 9060 XT 16GB. Once we get to native 4K, there's really no difference between the 5800X 3D, 7600X or 9800X 3D, though the 5800X 3D was still up to 23% faster than the Ryzen 5 5600 when using the RTX 5090. Now, switching to the Ultra preset naturally increases GPU load, but even so, at 1080p, with the RTX 5090, the 5800X 3D was still 32% faster than the 5600, but also 8% slower than the 7600X and 24% slower than the 9800X 3D. That said, most of those margins are completely eliminated when lowering the GPU performance with the RTX 5080, as here the 9800X 3D, 7600X and 5800X 3D are all within a few frames of one another. Jumping up to 1440p with the Ultra settings, we find that the 5800X 3D is 34% faster than the 5600 when using the RTX 5090, and then just 6% slower than the 7600X and 10% slower than the 9800X 3D. But with the RTX 5080, we see no performance difference between the 5800X 3D, 7600X and 9800X 3D, because here we are GPU limited at 94 FPS. And all three CPUs are capable of throughputting that level of performance. So needless to say, the data is fully GPU limited using the RX 9070 and 9060 XT 16GB. Finally, at native 4K, we're unsurprisingly heavily GPU limited, and now the 5800X 3D and 9800X 3D delivered the same level of performance, even with the RTX 5090, as we're limited to just 90 FPS under these conditions. Now, time for the Space Marine 2 data, and again we'll start with the medium preset at 1080p. This is a very CPU heavy game, so the data is very useful for measuring CPU gaming performance. Using the RTX 5090, the 5800X 3D was just 2% slower than the 7600X, so in other words, both CPUs delivered a similar level of performance at around 90 FPS. That data though is extremely CPU limited, as the 9800X 3D was good for 130 FPS, meaning in this example, the 5800X 3D was 31% slower. We're looking at similar margins with the RTX 5080, so nothing terribly different to report there, but with the RX 9070, the Ryzen 5 5600 is now 11% slower than the 5800X 3D, whereas it was 18% slower using the RTX 5080 due to the additional CPU overhead incurred when using a GeForce GPU. Now, because this game is so heavy on the CPU, we see that even when using the 9060 XT 16GB, that the 5800X 3D is still 13% faster than the 5600 and 22% slower than the 9800X 3D. Even at 1440p, we see a large spread of results. The 5800X 3D and 7600X delivered similar performance, making the 5800X 3D 27% faster than the 5600, but also 30% slower than the 9800X 3D. And these margins were seen with both the RTX 5090 and 5080. Switching to the RX 9070 does help the struggling Ryzen 5 5600, and as a result the 5800X3D is now just 9% faster, as it unexpectedly fell behind the 7600X by an 11% margin. Then by the time we drop down to the 9060 XT 16GB, the 5800X3D, 7600X and 9800X3D all delivered identical performance, as the results are now 100% GPU limited. Okay, so even at 4K, with the medium settings, we are still seeing a wide range of results with the high-end GeForce GPUs. Using the RTX 5090, for example, the 5800X3D is 32% faster than the 5600, but also 31% slower than the 9800X3D. So a huge range there. We do see some GPU limited results with the 5080, as the 9800X3D is limited to 104 FPS, but even so that meant the 5800X3D was 16% slower, despite beating the 5600 by a 32% margin. Once we drop down to the Radeon GPUs though, the results become 100% GPU limited. Now switching to the Ultra preset, we find almost the exact same data when compared to the 1080p medium results, with the 9060 XT 16GB being the only exception, as that GPU is limited to around 82 FPS when using the Ultra settings. But with the RTX 5090, the 5800X3D was good for about 90 FPS, the same level of performance seen from the 7600X, making the Zen 4-based X3D processor 22% faster than the 5600, but also 31% slower than the 9800X3D, and we see very similar results using the RTX 5080. The 1440p Ultra data still saw the 5800X3D lead the 5600 by a 24% margin when using the RTX 5090, while it was 28% slower than the 9800X3D, and again we see similar results with the RTX 5080. Under these conditions, switching to the RX 9070 seemed to help the 5800X3D more than the 5600, as now the X3D part was 23% faster, and due to the GPU limits was 16% slower than the 9800X3D. Now at 4K, the data, as you'd expect, starts to become more GPU limited, though that isn't the case with the RTX 5090, as here the 5800X3D is still 33% faster than the 5600, and also 26% slower than the 9800X3D. Dropping down to the RTX 5080 did reduce the margin, as here the 5800X3D is now just 5% slower than the 9800X3D, though it was still 21% faster than the Ryzen 5 5600. Beyond that though, all the data was heavily GPU limited, using the RX 9070 and 9060 XT 16GB. Finally, we have the 4-game average, calculated using the geomean, which isn't particularly useful given I have only tested 4 games, but I know you guys like the average data, so let's just go over it. Across the 4 games tested at 1080p, using the medium preset, we found when using the RTX 5090 that the 5800X3D was just 3% slower than the 7600X, or 6% slower when looking at the 1% lows. Then when compared to the 5600, we're looking at a 28% performance boost, though it did end up almost 30% slower than the 9800X3D, but still, very solid performance overall. Now the results when using the RTX 5080 were very similar, though here the 9800X3D is limited by GPU performance, making the 5800X3D 19% slower in this example. Using the RX 9070, the 5800X3D managed to match the 7600X, making it just 9% slower than the 9800X3D, but up to 21% faster than the 5600. Then when downgrading to the 9060 XT, the 5800X3D was just 6% slower than the 9800X3D, and 4% faster than the 5600, as this data is largely GPU limited. Upping the resolution to 1440p with the medium settings, we find when using the RTX 5090 that the 5800X3D was able to roughly match the 7600X, making it on average 30% faster than the 5600, but also 24% slower than the 9800X3D, though that margin was reduced to 10% with the RTX 5080, and then 9% using the RX 9070 before performance equalizes with the 9060 XT. Then at native 4K, as you might expect, the margins are considerably smaller, even when using the RTX 5090, as this configuration saw the 5800X3D trail the 9800X3D by just a 10% margin, while it was 14% faster than the 5600, delivering 7600X-like performance. The margins do shrink further with the RTX 5080, as here the 5800X3D was on average just 4% slower than the 9800X3D and just 7% faster than the 5600. Beyond that, the results are 100% GPU limited using the RX 9070 and 9060 XT 16GB. Now, switching to the Ultra preset data, we find when using the RTX 5090 that the 5800X3D was good for 170 FPS, making it just 3% slower than the 7600X when comparing the average frame rate. However, if you focus on the 1% lows, the 5800X3D ends up being 6% slower, but still very competitive results between those two CPUs. Now, when compared to the 9800X3D, the 5800X3D ends up being 23% slower, but despite that it was 30% faster than the Ryzen 5 5600. However, those margins do change quite dramatically once we downgrade to the RTX 5080. This configuration saw the 5800X3D beat the 5600 by a 21% margin, still solid, but a fairly large reduction when compared to the RTX 5090 results. And the biggest change though can be seen when comparing with the 9800X3D, as the 5800X3D is just 11% slower, basically matching the 7600X exactly. Then when we downgrade to the RX 9070, the margins are reduced further, and now the 5800X3D is just 9% slower than the 9800X3D and just 6% faster than the 5600. That being the case, it's unsurprising that we see little to no difference between these CPUs when using the 9060 XT. The 1440p data becomes increasingly GPU limited, and now we find that even when using the RTX 5090, that the 5800X3D is just 13% slower than the 9800X3D, or 17% slower when looking at the 1% lows. Those are still some decent margins in favour of the newer 9800X3D, but given the 5800X3D's age, it is doing incredibly well. It was also just 3% slower than the 7600X, or 6% slower when comparing 1% lows. The big upgrade can be seen when going from the 5600 to the 5800X3D, as the 3D V-cache part is almost 30% faster. But once again, if we reduce GPU performance just a little bit with the RTX 5080, the results become far more GPU limited. For example, the 5800X3D is now 10% slower than the 9800X3D, but also just 6% faster than the 5600. So under these conditions, the old Ryzen 5 part is stacking up really well. Then, with the Radeon RX 9070, we see just a 10% difference between the slowest and fastest CPUs, with the 5800X3D right in the middle, and that being the case, the results are 100% GPU limited using the 9060 XT. Finally, we have the native 4K data, and as you might have expected, the results are 100% GPU limited using the 9060 XT and 9070, while the same is mostly true for the RTX 5080. Even with the 5090, the 5800X3D is just 8% slower than the 9800X3D and 10% faster than the 5600. So there you have it. As I'm sure many of you expected, the Ryzen 7 5800X3D is still an extremely capable CPU. It's really ideal for use up to an RTX 5080 or 4090, and even then, for most single-player games, it'll suit even right up to the RTX 5090. Of course, as I've stressed countless times now in the past, it really does depend on the games you play and how you play them, as to how important CPU performance is for you. For the most part, in terms of gaming performance, the 5800X3D is roughly equal to the Ryzen 5 7600X, and we consider the 7600X to be a very good gaming CPU, so naturally, the same is also true for the 5800X3D. And really, the 5800X3D, as well as the binned 5700X3D, have proven to be an amazing upgrade option for AM4 owners. And as we saw here, deliver on average almost 30% more performance than a part such as the Ryzen 5 5600, when CPU limited of course. And there were examples where the Ryzen 5 5600 was limiting performance to the degree that you'd be unhappy with even if you owned a Radeon RX 9070 for example. So while still a very solid performer today, and obviously an amazing value part, if you have upgraded your GPU recently and you own a 5600, it might be time to start thinking about a CPU upgrade, either to the 5700X3D or 5800X3D, whichever I guess is cheaper, or perhaps make the trip over to AM5. There are a few examples where I suspect DDR5 was helping the 7600X to deliver better 1% low performance than the 7800X3D, making the upgrade to AM5 a little more attractive, and it's possible the 7600X will age better due to this increased memory bandwidth. But generally speaking, the 7600X and 5800X 3D are still very similar in terms of gaming performance. Anyway, that is going to do it for this 5800X 3D CPU and GPU scaling benchmark. If you enjoyed the testing, please give the video a like. Don't forget to subscribe because we will have more of this type of content coming up soon. Also, there's the join button or Patreon if you want to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness. Signing up via either one of those methods will give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&A stuff, and behind the scenes content. So check that out if you're interested. If not, that is of course perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host Steve. See you again next time.